This is lesson 3, and we're going to be discussing bias in studies, why it occurs, and how we can try and minimize it as best as possible. So we know that from conducting studies, we're trying to draw inferences about a population from a given sample. If we take a random sample of DC students and find they work an average of 18 hours per week, we can infer that the average for the whole school is 18 hours per week. However, this largely depends on the sample that we're looking at. So in general, the bigger the sample, the better the estimate. So if we randomly selected 2 students at DC and found they worked an average of 5 hours per week, could we infer that the average for the whole school is 5 hours per week? Well, no, absolutely not, because that sample is too small. So part of the experimental design when we're creating a study is knowing that your estimate of the population is only as good as your sampling design. So sampling is preferred to a census for convenience and efficiency. We're not going to try and sample every single person in the population. But bad sampling methods and questions yield results that aren't going to accurately reflect the population. And the key here is we really, really want it to reflect the population, so we have to be very careful when we're setting up our studies to make sure that we're reducing bias and using good sampling methods. So when we talk about bias studies, bias in general is producing inaccurate information that systematically favors one outcome over other outcomes. We want to work really hard to eliminate bias in a study. So for example, one type of bias that we see come up a lot is coverage bias. So we're either over or underrepresenting a portion of the population. So if we keep talking about the student body of our school, if we're looking at one way of over-representing part of the student body at our school, so we might say if our population is all students, but we only pick 9th graders, so we only sample 9th graders, then our 9th graders are overrepresented. Because we have too many of them in our sample if we're considering a population of all students at our high school. Similarly, if we're looking at an example of underrepresenting teachers, if our population is all teachers, but we only sample math teachers, then other subject area teachers are underrepresented. So that's coverage bias. We're either overrepresenting or underrepresenting a portion of the population. Non-response bias is what it sounds like. Participants can't be contacted or they refuse to participate. So non-response means we didn't get a response from them. But we also have a response bias, where respondents might underestimate or exaggerate. So asking kids, what's your exact GPA? Or how long should a lunch period be? Students, if you're asking them how long a lunch period should be, might say a whole hour because they want more time with their friends. If you ask somebody what their exact GPA is, they're more likely to round because they're trying to exaggerate. And then there's also hidden bias, which is often referred to as implicit bias. So when we talk about hidden or implicit bias, it's an unconscious or automatic attitude towards someone or something. So we don't always know our participants' backgrounds to account for their bias, which is why sampling is super important to get a good range of different kinds of backgrounds. So there's different ways we get bias results. It can either be from poor sampling methods or poor questioning methods or wording. We're going to look at the sampling methods first. So poor sampling methods, keep in mind sampling methods is how we're gathering the subjects and the responses. One way that bias shows up is in a self-selected sample. And that's when people are volunteering themselves to be in the sample. So a lot of times if you send out a survey and you just wait for people to respond, you might get individuals with really strong pro or strong anti opinions. And you might also see things if you send out a self-selected sample on the internet via email per se, then the people in the population who don't have the internet can't access the sample. Or maybe you give it as a paper-based survey and they don't show up the day of the survey. People are choosing to be part of the sample or opting out of the sample in a self-selected population. We also see a lot of bias in a convenience sample. I always spell convenience wrong. And in a convenience sample, you're doing an easy to reach member of a population. So for example, if Miss Jordan only samples her AP Calc students because that's who she has during the day, and she uses them to represent all of her math students. Or if Mr. Figgy only samples the juniors for a survey about home mortgages and then says that applies to the opinions of the whole high school. A convenience sample is when you're reaching out to the group closest to you and seeing whether or not those people can be representative of a larger population that you don't necessarily have access to easily. So that is sampling methods that are biased. Now, if we look at questioning methods or wording, leading questions prompt or encourage a specific answer. So if you say, don't you think peanut butter should be banned from all schools for the safety of students with allergens? Adding this end part, for the safety of students with allergens, if somebody says no, then it makes them sound like they don't care about the safety of students. Or if you ask, an excellent teacher writes out formal daily lesson plans, do you write out formal daily lesson plans? Well, you're automatically implying that if the teacher says no, then they're not an excellent teacher. So leading questions are encouraging an answer that the person asking it wants to hear. There's also loaded questions. In a loaded questions, they contain controversial or unjustified assumptions, and they may require a response that is too broad and difficult to precisely explain. So, for example, asking people, why are women considered better caretakers for children than men? That's already assuming that somebody thinks that women are better caretakers for children. Or asking something like, what celebrity has no right being a celebrity? That's a very broad question and might require a lot of specific details in order to answer fully. There's also choice bias. Maybe if you're not asking open-ended questions, but you're asking closed-ended questions, you might be limiting or confusing choices in a study. So, for example, there's repeated choice bias, where if we look at our different intervals, we can see that there's overlap. So for somebody who earned 15 credits in high school per se, Which one of these two options do they select? The 10 to 15 or the 15 to 20? Because 15 is represented in both. There's also a limited choice bias, where you're limiting the choices people have to choose from. So if you were to ask, which teacher will you come back to visit at DC after graduation, and then you only give these 4 options, well, what if they're not going to come back to visit any of them? What if a teacher they would visit is just not on the list? There is also one to add at the bottom here, a double-barreled question. There is only one L in barreled. So in a double-barreled question, you're touching on more than one topic. But you're only allowing for one answer. So an example of that, do you find college classes to be more demanding and more interesting than high school classes? So you're asking if someone finds them more demanding and more interesting when comparing the two groups, but you're really only allowing for a yes or no answer here, the way it's worded. And that's not necessarily the case. So those are different kinds of questions. And when we consider all of this, we need to remember your estimate of the population is only as good as your sampling design. So we have to keep in mind, it is only an estimate. You'd likely get different results if you did more random samples. We have to make sure that we work hard to eliminate bias, and we have to consider that the bigger the sample, the better our results are going to be. So there's some examples below. Identify the sampling method used, and then discuss why it could create bias in a study for the first example. And then for the second example, identifying the questioning method and discuss why it could create bias. So here's a good place to pause and then double check your work on identifying sampling methods and how they can introduce bias. So for the first example, sports journalism, for an upcoming article, a college sports writer hopes to argue that all college coaches believe wooden bats should be mandatory at the D1 level. In the first study, the writer attends a college coaches clinic held at the local sports venue in his area. He meets with college coaches of varying levels and sports who attend the clinic, interviewing them about making it mandatory to use wooden bats at the Division I level. The key here is at the local sports venue in his area. That's a convenient sample. This individual did not have to go far to be able to meet with these college coaches. And the issue this might have in terms of creating bias is coaches who attend the clinic might have very specific opinions about mandating wooden bats at the college level. So they went to their local clinic early, and the fact that you're at a clinic with a bunch of college coaches, depending on what the clinic is about, they might have very specific opinions about the use of wooden bats. In the second study, the sports writer emails an optional survey to all D1 baseball coaches. He does not receive responses from every coach by his deadline and only works from the responses provided. This is a self-selected sample. So the issue here is that strong opinions are most likely to respond quickly. And in this case, this might underrepresent coaches with milder opinions. Typically, people responding to a survey that gets emailed out, if they respond quickly, it's because they have a really strong positive or really strong negative experience, and they want their opinion heard. Whereas people who have more milder opinions are more likely to take their time to answer something like that and really kind of get their opinion out there on a slower time scale, because it's not as strongly important to them, because they fall more in the middle of pro and anti of whatever the topic is about. So for the second example, where we're identifying the questioning method and discussing why it could create bias, we're looking at school finances in a parent survey. So one of the questions asked, should your school spend less money on technology and more money on safety personnel? This is a double-barreled question. So a parent might have two different opinions. On money spent on technology and money spent on security. But they're only able to give one answer here. So the second question, like most concerned parents, don't you agree that schools spend too much money on innovative classroom technology? This is a leading question. They're saying, like most concerned parents, and don't you agree? They're being led to believe that most parents feel this way. And then finally, what key cultural and economic factors of the students at any school should be considered when districts are researching new technology to purchase for their schools? That is a loaded question. There is not a simple answer to this question, especially if we're talking about key cultural and economic factors. There is a long and complicated answer here. So that is lesson 3, bias in studies. Bias coming up not only in our sampling methods, but also in the way that we are wording our questions.